Hi, welcome to all the fanfare. My name is Eric Pierce. Today I'm joined by a brilliant writer and fellow Star Wars fanatic, Krista, who is behind the very Star Wars centric Credits and Canon website that I love browsing. Krista, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
It's nice to be here.
It is great to have you because today we're talking about Star Wars. We're talking about the Star Wars. If you are a long-term Star Wars fan, you might refer to this film as Star Wars because originally it was just Star Wars. And then when I came onto the scene, by then it was Episode 4, A New Hope. And that's how I refer to it. But it is the original Star Wars. And without this film, there would be no Star Wars franchise or any of this other stuff that we've come to know and love about the franchise. And I think it would be a good place to start when you talk about, there's a lot of different things you could talk about with this movie and then kind of culturally what it means and the significance of it. But for me, a lot of my memories of Star Wars are kind of tied up in my personal memories of childhood and things like that. And I thought that'd be a good place to start with this discussion is just like how and where and when we discovered Star Wars, if it was through this movie and just kind of our memories of that. So Krista, I guess what was your Star Wars origin story?
Not sure exactly what age I was. I was older than 10, but younger than 13 when I watched Star Wars, A New Hope, formerly Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the honor of being able to watch it going in cold, like with no knowledge of what it was. And I think I was at home during the summer and I was bored, and my dad had a pretty extensive VHS collection. So I pulled it out and watched it, and I was just totally just enthralled and like just drawn in from the moment of the crawl, which I love to read as a kid, and just starting something that reminded me of a like summary in a book jacket was just really cool.
Yeah.
Introducing the world. So, and I was lucky enough to where after I finished Star Wars, I could move on to Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. I didn't have to wait for years, especially after that twist at the end of Empire Strikes Back. But yeah, that started my whole love affair and really got me reading more. I got into the Legends books, mainly with Jason and Jaina, who were not relevant anymore, really. But
sadly, no. Yeah. Yes, similar to you. So I'm slightly older than you, so my memories of Star Wars are a little hazier. The first Star Wars movie I actually remember seeing is Return of the Jedi, but I knew of Star Wars before that because I had like this, frankly, and this is kind of sad maybe, but it works for Star Wars. Like my first memories of Star Wars have to do more with probably the toys than the movies, because like when I was, I don't know, 4 or 5 or whatever, like those Christmases were Star Wars Christmases. You got a bunch of Star Wars toys and stuff. Clearly I had seen the movies, but because I knew like Luke and Darth Vader, but I have no memory of seeing the movies. It was almost like Star Wars was just this thing I was born into and it was just always there. But I don't have distinct memories of like seeing it the first time. Unfortunately, it was just, again, it was almost like your parents. They were just always there. Like Star Wars was just always there for me. I do know confidently that this movie is the reason I love Star Wars. And I think it's fashionable, and most people would say The Empire Strikes Back is the best Star Wars movie. I think you and I might disagree about that a little bit. We'll touch on that. But I think a lot of people would say Empire is the best. When I was a kid, Empire was my least favorite because it was dark and I preferred Jedi in this film because of that. So for me, this was Star Wars. This was the movie that launched my love of Star Wars. And even rewatching it now, it kind of reminds me more than any of the other movies. It kind of taps me back into what it felt like to be a child discovering Star Wars for the first time. You said a bunch of things there that I want to touch on. You talked about the crawl. Maybe we'll just go there. I think the crawl is interesting because in one way it's very iconic. Like I can't think of another movie that really begins with just literal exposition, like text on a screen. There's plenty of them. A lot of times it's like the science fiction type movies because they're trying to frame you in something that's totally different. But the crawl, it's so iconic, it's so Star Wars that we kind of don't think about what it actually is until you take a step back. And to your point about just like that you like to read the crawl, I guess I'd love to hear more about what do you get out of the crawl, just as a storytelling mechanism or something that's uniquely Star Wars.
Well, first, I think George Lucas got that idea from Flash Gordon.
That's probably
I think,
true. Yeah.
yeah, but it was the first time I think, like in a film that was used as a device. I like it because when you're reading text, it feels like more of a saga, and for me, that opening crawl, seeing that right away, set up Star Wars as a part of a saga, folklore, like almost biblical,
Yes.
as more of a series of stories that were waiting to be told. So it just spoke to me with that. And from a creative decision, I think it was very genius because it allowed them to drop you in the middle of the action. Like, it's just like, you're with us, here's what's going on, let's go.
Yeah, that's a great
So,
point. You and I had kind of been bouncing ideas back and forth about things we might like want to talk about on this podcast. And you raised a really good one that I was going to save for the tail end, but I'm going to pull it forward now because it ties in what you're saying. Specifically, you had said, why is it so difficult for Hollywood to create good science fiction and fantasy films? And I kind of feel like what you're saying about the crawl there maybe ties into it, because what distinguishes Star Wars for me versus a lot of other science fiction is that although it is a science fiction story, it's told, it occurs in outer space. There's blasters and spaceships and stuff. The foundations of the story are in the mythic underpinnings that inform a lot of our society, going back to like Greek culture and things like that. And then you mentioned kind of almost like biblical storytelling. So I think these movies tap into something that's just innately part of the storytelling tradition that I think a lot
mhm.
of other genre films just kind of skip over or gloss over because they're more about the polish and the shininess of like science fiction, right? Versus actual storytelling.
Well, yeah, and Star Wars is really like a mash of fantasy and science fiction. George Lucas popularized Joseph Campbell's A Hero's Journey,
Yep.
which had always been around, but Joseph Campbell was the one that kind of labeled the stages. And George Lucas was hugely influenced. And when a lot of people think of A Hero's Journey, they think of Star Wars.
Yep.
But it has been used from a lot of genres, like a lot of fantasy films like Harry Potter and
Mm-hmm.
even like Men in Black. So basically all the big franchises, including Lord of the Rings and even Avatar.
You brought up Joseph Campbell. I actually at one point tried to read his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, but I couldn't get through it because it's too academic. It was too dry for me.
Cliff Notes, man. Cliff
Yeah,
Notes.
definitely. It's a slog. If you're interested in him at all, he did a great interview on PBS like for years ago that kind of distills it and makes it more approachable. But if you want the cliff note of cliff notes, you just watch Star Wars because the best stuff of Campbell's work is in Star Wars.
Yeah.
Just to hang on that for just a second longer, though, this topic about Hollywood and their struggles, it seems like once Hollywood finds something that works, they just kind of repeat it ad nauseum. I think
Yeah.
you could look at the MCU. MCU comic books they're not science fiction. They're not quite fantasy. They're kind of in between, maybe a little bit. I think they may lean more fantasy, but that's a bit of an outlier, at least in the beginning. But even that has become endlessly regurgitated. But
But they lean
initially,
heavily
no, go ahead.
into mythology though.
They do, and I think that's what separates them from the DC movies. It's frustrating because, like, I like Batman, I like Superman, I like all those characters, but the movies, they put the cart before the horse, and they try and have gravitas and all these things, and weight to their storytelling, but they don't invest properly in characters. And I guess the focus is on the films is in the wrong place. And a lot of the science fiction and fantasy films that I've seen recently that I haven't liked, it's because it's more about the setting than about the story.
Yeah, I mean, it's become a franchise only genre that needs to be from a popular book series to get made. Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Dune. A large part of that is they have built in audiences.
Yes.
It's
Yep.
probably easier for a studio executive to sell
Yeah.
because it's a huge investment, for these studios. Lucas was cooking with 11 million, I believe, the original Star Wars, which is a lot of money back in the day, but it's still nothing compared to the budgets today. And also, looking at Star Wars and Avatar, two of the biggest fantasy science fiction genres, their creators, George Lucas and James Cameron, also made huge technological innovations as part of these films.
Yeah.
So, for me, the aesthetic of Star Wars is also very cool. The 70s retro infusion. And I think the world of these does have to, story is important, but the worlds also have to be unique and interesting. And I think that when people think of fantasy, they might think more of medieval Europe combined
Yes.
with like dragons and elves. But you look at Dune, Avatar, Star Wars, they're very unique. And you could pick out a design of a ship and be like, that's from Star Wars. I think you could possibly do that for Dune, but there's other unique looks to that world. But Avatar is just totally different as well, and each film has been pretty different in its environment. So I think that's also a key thing, is the world has to look cool.
Yep, you had to be excited to go there, to spend time there. I think Avatar is another good example. In both the case of Star Wars and Avatar, you made a great point about how both films kind of push the envelope on what film could actually be and how films are made. But also, the storytelling is still front and center. Like both directors are interested in telling a good story, and part of that is the setting. It is you need character, you need setting, you need conflict. All those things have to come together to tell a good story. Otherwise, we're not going to be talking about the story unless it's going to be like, wow, that one really sucked. But I do think you're totally right. And if you look at science fiction at the time in the 70s and even now, it is more, science fiction had always been futuristic, and then therefore it was kind of shiny, glossy, almost utopic in a way. And Star Wars just brought grittiness into it, and everything looked used and beat up. And in that way, it almost felt a little more relatable, I guess. It's weird. It almost like humanized the technology in a sense, because it looked like something that we could be comfortable living in. Yeah, tangible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I could take the parts if I wanted to, and I had the time. I could potentially take the parts and build something from that world myself.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's a unique blend. Like you said, Star Wars is a part of the reason it's so beloved, I think, is because it's a bit of a melting pot of genres and influences that George kind of just threw in a blender, and it could have gone bad, but it came together so beautifully. And there's a reason, like almost 50 years later, we're still talking about this movie.
Yeah, going back to what you were saying about most people, would say that Empire Strikes Back is the best Star Wars film, and objectively, maybe that's true. But for me, I go based on rewatchability, and Star Wars: A New Hope is the most rewatchable of all of them. It's simple. It has three strong acts that transition seamlessly into one another, because the movie is just one big chase for the Death Star plans.
Yep.
I mean, it's incredibly simple. And thinking about everything that this film had to accomplish, it had to introduce you to this universe that was far away and takes place in the past.
Yep.
Introduce you to all the characters, the concept of the Jedi, the concept of the Force, and have a complete story, but leave the door open for continuation.
Yes.
They pulled it off.
And I think part of the reason it's such a good story is it does all that stuff you said so seamlessly, because like Obi-Wan Kenobi describing how the Force works, it's done kind of during other scenes that are doing other things. It's not, even though, we have our quote unquote like training scenes, like when Luke's learning how to use the lightsaber or that kind of thing. It's happening while they're on their way to Alderaan, or they think they're on their way to Alderaan. They're never going to make it.
Planet formerly known as Alderaan.
That's right. Asteroid field, formerly known as Alderaan. Yeah. But it's to your point, it's very the story is very propulsive. You're constantly moving, and While there are plenty of slow moments, and in fact, part of the reason I put this one slightly below Empire is there's like towards the beginning of the movie, there's like an 8-minute stretch where it's just following the droids around Tatooine when they first arrive. That it feels like a Project Time. It's very 70s like in that whole sequence, and just that the slow build up. It reminded me a lot of the first Christopher Reeve Superman movie, in that the beginning of that movie it's a bit slow. It takes a while to get going. It spends time like I really dislike the Krypton stuff in that movie at the very beginning because it's just kind of slow and cheesy. In Star Wars, like I do love the droids. I love all the Tatooine stuff, but at the same time, you have that amazing opening, and then the film just kind of takes like 2 steps back and slows way down as these droids are just kind of wandering around, and then Luke shows up and then picks up again, and then Han shows up, and then the movie really takes off. For me, I totally agree with what you said about this being it's a perfect standalone film. Like if Star Wars had stopped here, if it had been a one and done film, it would be amazing. It's perfect in that it's self-contained and it can exist on its own. But at the same time, for me, it's just a little behind Empire because of Empire takes a lot of the things that this movie introduces and makes them better, in my opinion. But it is an incomplete movie at the same time, right? It ends on a cliffhanger. It doesn't stand alone. Talking about Star Wars, we've been talking about grittiness, and I think you and I are both of the opinion that Tatooine is like an awesome planet. I know a lot of people kind of roll their eyes when, so there's that great line in The Force Awakens where Finn is like, why does everyone want to go back to Jakku? Because that planet, like he hates that planet, right? I think in the fandom, there's a lot of people who feel that way about Tatooine. Like, why does everyone want to go back to Tatooine? Why are we always going back to Tatooine? And on some level, I kind of understand it because it's a bit, it's very deserty. You could call it ugly, but I'm with you. I think it's quintessential like Western, and it's such it's the best Star Wars planet in my opinion. I'm excited every time we go there. Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Tatooine because I think you and I may be in the minority on this one.
I mean, when you say the word Tatooine, you could say Twin Suns, Jawas, Banthas. There's so many iconic things in pop culture that relate to Tatooine. Can you say that about any other planet?
No. Alderaan.
Tatooine. Yeah. I mean,
no.
Tatooine did a lot of heavy lifting for establishing the feel of Star Wars universe.
Yes.
And I think that it remains the most lived in world in Star Wars, despite other worlds like Coruscant that have gotten a lot of attention. It also is more tied with the Skywalker saga. You begin on Tatooine and you end on Tatooine.
Yep.
So I think it's great. And that Luke kind of looking over the landscape at the Twin Suns is such an iconic image.
Yes. Yep. Binary sunset. The score swelling. That's one of my favorite moments in all Star Wars. It's there's no dialogue, no exposition. And at the same time, you know exactly what he's thinking and feeling because I think it's something every young person has felt at some point. Like, why is my life unfair? Like, why am I stuck here? I'm yearning for something bigger and better.
Yeah. And I think that's why it's important that slow start with the droids, which I love because you really get settled into the world of Tatooine and the droids are not in danger of dying of thirst walking across a desert landscape, but you can see the environment and automatically, without even meeting Luke, understand why he might want to leave.
That's a good point. This place kind of sucks. Like you and I would probably be excited to go there, but I understand. You're right. You can understand why.
Yeah.
To visit, of course.
Visit.
Yeah, like I would like. So I know in Tunisia where they shot the Tatooine scenes, I believe they still have some of the Star Wars set there for touristy like reasons. So people will actually come to Tunisia, the country, and like drive out to the middle of the desert to see some of the sets because the government has chosen to just kind of like maintain / keep it, shoveled out of sand so people can come there and spend their money to be there. I would totally do it. Like, even though it'd probably be like 100 degrees and everything else, like just because it's Like when I think about Star Wars, Tatooine is like in the top half of things I think about because it is so iconic to the story. It would not be Star Wars without Tatooine for me.
Yeah, I mean, it's Tatooine and I think Dagobah.
Yeah, yep. Less so
So,
Endor, like you said, maybe a bit of Coruscant. Um, but yeah, Tatooine, they nailed it. The very first planet. Star Wars clearly has a Western influence. You've got, bounty hunters and gunslingers and the cantina, which is basically just an analog for like a Western saloon. And there's like a, bar brawl and all this stuff happens on the desert planet, which I'm sure that's intentional, but at the same time, it makes me love it more because I really enjoy the Western influence on Star Wars and the fact that part of what I love about the movies is that these characters are clear archetypes of things we already know. Like Han Solo's the kind of the gunslinger. You've got Obi-Wan, who's the old knight. You've got Princess Leia, who's the princess. And for me, like I love westerns, so I like that we have this clear Western influence on this movie, and that we actually have time on this planet where we're seeing what a Western in Star Wars in like a futuristic setting would look like, which is again part of the reason I love Tatooine, I guess.
and desert landscapes just look cinematic. Westerns look cinematic, but they also work well in serialization, which I think is why Dave Filoni
Yes.
obviously loves westerns too, and he's
Yep.
incorporated a lot of that in the Clone Wars, and I think that's what works for The Mandalorian, which I associate more as a western than A New
Yeah.
Hope. Star Wars for me works best when, yes, it has those western elements, but when it combines melodrama and angst, or soap opera elements, spy elements, infiltration, and
Yes.
epic space battles. So, A New Hope, Rogue One, the third act, Aldhani arc in Andor. And it's interesting because we're recording this right before D23, and
Yep.
it's highly likely that we're going to hear more about the Mandalorian and Grogu film, which I think will be the most Western Star Wars film.
I think you're right. Although I will say the Solo movie might have the belt right now, but I think you're right that the Mandalorian specifically is very Western. Mando, Din Djarin is clearly like someone that came right out of a Western type of movie, and a lot of his plot lines have to do with just that lifestyle. And like every episode is like his spaceship going to a different planet. It's really no different than like a gunslinger taking his horse to a different town, and solving the problem there and then moving on to a different area. So, but yeah, I think you're right. The movie definitely could take that from Solo. It just depends on how much of the movie's going to be about some of the bigger stuff circling, like with Thrawn and Ahsoka and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right, Solo, and that's a beautiful looking film.
It is. Yep. Yeah, underrated for sure.
Yeah, it was really weird to go into the theaters on opening day, and the theater wasn't completely full.
I was very conflicted, so this is probably a good time to talk about Han. I was very conflicted about that movie because I love Han Solo, and the reason I love Han Solo is because of this movie, this and Empire, really. But to me, he's my favorite Star Wars character, and a lot of the reason I love him is because of this movie. So when we got Solo, I was very conflicted because new Star Wars, yay, love it. At the same time, why do we need an origin story for Han Solo? Like, A New Hope is his origin story. We meet him as this roguish scoundrel who is all about the money, and that's really all he cares about because he's always in trouble. He needs to save his own bacon. And then the arc of this movie is him becoming a hero, and then that carries on to the next movie. So the fact that we then needed something before that, I was super conflicted about that. Granted, I do like Solo the movie. I think it's a good movie. It's a good Star Wars movie, but I do wish that if they're going to spend several $100 million on a Star Wars movie, like I would have picked a lot of different things to cover versus on Solo.
I'd love to see what that Obi-Wan Kenobi film would have looked like, but I do think that film Solo would have been better if it had came out during Christmas.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
I do think
absolutely.
it was a little too close to The Last Jedi and that toxic
Yeah.
discourse. So yeah, what's with Lucasfilm trying to remove all the mystery from Han Solo, even with the special editions? Like,
It's weird. Like if you look at the meta story around Star Wars, um, so George Lucas made this movie because he originally wanted to do Flash Gordon but couldn't get the rights. So then he started kind of making his own Flash Gordon. And so he creates this movie, but there's a clear pivot after Empire where the direction is really less about storytelling and becomes more about commercialism or profit or things like that, because a lot of his choices with Return of the Jedi were made because he was thinking about the bottom line. So like originally Han Solo was supposed to die in that movie, but then he was afraid of toy sales basically. So he backed away from that. And you can kind of see then that narrative, that meta narrative following through with the special editions, because he then retcons that iconic moment with Greedo where he, in the original movie, Han just kills Greedo in cold blood. Granted, Greedo's probably going to kill him anyway, so Han just getting the drop on him. But the special edition then retcon that so that Greedo shot first and Han is shooting in self-defense. So it's less about, I guess Han becomes less someone who's capable of just murder. I understand why you would do that. And again, George likes to talk about these movies being for kids, but it is interesting. The original cut, Han just straight up killed this guy. And I personally prefer that version because I think it makes his arc a lot more interesting, because he starts as this very self-centered person who'll do anything to save his own skin, including killing somebody. And then by the end of the movie, he's willing to risk his life to save his friends. I think that's a lot more powerful arc versus what the special editions version gave us.
I agree. I don't think about that too much, but it is a big character change.
Yeah, it
just
is.
That one scene. For me, like I don't like the Jabba.
Oh, the Jabba's so bad.
I like Jabba being built up through A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back as like a secondary antagonist.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you first see him, well, not anymore, but when you first see him in Return of the Jedi, he is intimidating because he doesn't have to move. And just seeing him move in A New Hope, it's just like, and Han is stepping on his tail and they have to digitally move him up and down. And it's so disrespectful. And if I was Jabba the Hutt and a big mob boss, I'd have him killed just for stepping on my tail. But it removes the menace and the danger of Jabba the Hutt. It is weird, like how both the major changes from special editions in A New Hope affect Han Solo. The special edition changes for good don't really come until Empire Strikes Back or Return of the Jedi.
You did say something I wanted to key on that I think is a really great point, and part of what George does in this movie that's so good. You're talking about how this movie kind of establishes Jabba's mystique, and we just hear about this guy, and then so when we meet him later, we properly are, if not necessarily afraid of him, we at least respect him properly because we've heard about him. We know he's someone to be feared. The movie just drops his name, and like we just get a little context, and that's it. This movie does the same thing with things like the Clone Wars and like the Republic and Jedi. We just kind of get all these juicy, like Clone Wars is such a juicy set of words that it's just enough to tantalize you and like make you wonder like what is that, and then the story's moving on, so you don't ever get the like real context. It's almost a version of like foreshadowing and story structure at the same time, where he's just seeding the script with these combinations of words is really what they are, but they fire my imagination and they make the movie. I think part of the reason everyone loves Star Wars like they do is because it lives in your imagination. You think about it after the fact, and and a lot of modern Star Wars is kind of mining that, right? Like going into the past and showing us what the Clone Wars actually look like and all that stuff. This movie, to your point at the beginning of the pod, about all the things George has done or this movie does to just build the universe. It's even in the little things, like those little details, like just a name drop, you know?
I think of Star Wars as a living, breathing document that can be improved upon, changed, experienced in different ways. And I
Yep.
think my life and my stress level is all the better for it.
Yeah.
Because people really, really hold a lot of ideas precious to them. So, and even the Clone Wars mentioned, I didn't even, watching it the first time, it kind of went in and out. And it wasn't until like the Clone Wars film and then the TV series was like, oh yeah, he did mention that. And now we get to see it. And it's such a wonderful part of the Star Wars mythos now.
We've talked quite a bit. So because I guess I backed into it because I love him, but I worked Han Solo in the conversation because he's my favorite part of Star Wars. I would love to hear about your favorite part of Star Wars, and I guess maybe that's tied up into your, what made the Star Wars saga like come alive for you specifically.
I think besides the world building, character wise, Leia, I think just having a powerhouse female character who's not the hero in the hero's journey, but she's an active participant in the action scenes. She drives a lot of the action. She is a object of intrigue. I'll say not an object of desire for Luke and Han, but an
Yeah, that's
object
great.
of intrigue for them in this film. She's not sexualized in
Yep.
this film. That comes later.
Yeah, unfortunately, that comes later.
And even the way that Carrie Fisher plays her and her posture is very assured. Just being a girl and just watching, when Luke rescues her in her cell and she's just like laying there and just like, you. I thought there's something so cool about that. And other than, Leia, I actually really like Tarkin. To this day, I think he's one of the best antagonists in Star Wars, and I never felt the need to learn more about him or his motivations. I just love him as he is presented in this film, a cold, calculating bastard.
Yep.
I think there's a lot of like funny, like situational humor, of course, in the escaping the Death Star. But one of my favorite moments is when Tarkin lies to Leia that, she told him the location of the rebel base he would spare Alderaan. He blows it up, and then he's offended that she lied to him about the location, saying it was Tatooine. And he's like, she lied to us. I was like, yeah. But Peter Cushing plays that so well, and it's just so real how politicians are. Yeah, but the character work is just, I think, really great. And it's a Oscar-nominated screenplay, I should say. So
it is. Yep.
People think of Star Wars, they want to say it like, oh, Star Wars has always had, bad dialogue. Like, no.
I think the actors would definitely. I know I've heard stories from the first. I think the first movie, specifically Harrison Ford said something like, "You can write this, but you can't say it." Something to that effect. Like, because the actors were struggling with, I guess, some of the word choices, or like, just like I'm thinking about when Han's telling Luke about what it's like to travel through hyperspace when they're escaping Tatooine. If you've never seen Star Wars before, it's full of gobbledygook, but as someone who knows Star Wars, like, yeah, like everything he's saying makes sense because I know what all that stuff means. I think the dialogue is, I personally love the dialogue, at least in these movies. I think in the prequels it gets a bit hairy, and
Luke.
Yeah, it gets a bit bad. But also, I think to your point about the performances, I think when you have good actors, they can elevate even bad dialogue and make it something that has gravitas and emotion versus just reciting the words. So you get those great exchanges between Leia and Tarkin, which maybe if you just read the script, you'd be like, you might read it one way, and then when you see the actors portraying the characters and bringing emotion into it, it lands totally differently. Yeah, I'm on the side of, at least in these movies, the dialogue it's Star Wars dialogue, but I think it fits the story, and it makes Star Wars unique in kind of among all movies because it almost has its own it almost has its own dialogue. Like no other movie sounds like Star Wars.
Yeah, and like you said, the actors sell it. They're having fun. At least they look like they're having fun. They're not stiff, which I think has been a problem in other Star Wars film and TV series.
Yep.
So,
yeah. You mentioned Tarkin. I do think it's interesting that so Darth Vader is like many consider him like the quintessential like villain, like the biggest bad guy ever. It is kind of interesting that in this movie, basically, he's almost like Tarkin's lapdog. Like Tarkin's the clear boss in this movie, and Vader is just kind of following his cues. So it really makes you like when you see Empire and you see what Vader's capable of and like how villainous he can be, it really kind of makes you retroactively appreciate like Tarkin was a boss. Like he was someone with real power and an influence. And to your point about Cushing's portrayal, I think it's so sinister but almost refined in a way. It's just I like you. I love the character. And then you mentioned Leia too. I've always thought it's funny that the heroes come, the quote unquote heroes come bumbling in to save her, and they're like in over their heads. They have no plan, and it's going sideways. And then Leia's like, give me your gun, you morons! Like I'm gonna rescue my rescuers. And she is a great character because she's not. The story's almost set up to be she's a damsel in distress. She's literally a princess that needs to be rescued. That's the story. But the character is not written to be that way. So it turns the whole convention on its head, and she is a very driven character. She stands toe to toe with the males, just as capable as they are. She rescues them more than once.
she also leads them into a garbage chute. So she makes mistakes. Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, but they do get out of it. I mean,
they do.
They do get out of it. Otherwise, Han and Luke would probably just would have stood there in a shootout with stormtroopers until they were dead or captured because they had no plan. Like their plan was to get in, and they had no get out. So,
yeah,
yeah, you're right. And part of what I really enjoy about rewatching this movie is, in a lot of I mentioned the MCU earlier. A lot of those movies are very formulaic in that the good guys always win, and you kind of just know going into it that like you have to suspend your disbelief because otherwise like you're just watching to see what happens. But in this movie, like there's a reason the good guys escape. Like the stormtroopers are like intentionally missing. They're like herding them towards the ship because the bad guys want to track them back to their base to destroy the rebel base. So you can look at the rescue and the escape as being heroic, but at the same time, you can look at it as, well, the bad guys let you go. And that's really the only reason you escape this heavily fortified base that probably has 100,000 stormtroopers on it or something. Like, I like that there's this layer of the villains are intentionally working to further their goals, which in this case isn't actually to put them all in jail. It's to follow them back to where they came from. The story lands with feels more like realistic to me versus something where it's like, yeah, the hero's up against impossible odds, but they're going to win because they're the hero.
Yeah, there's like a strategy to it, which is why Tarkin was a big loss in the first film for the Empire.
Absolutely.
So, but yeah, the trench run it's great to have like a long action scene in the second act with them rescuing Princess Leia and escaping the Death Star, and then going right into that trench run, which is shorter but equally as tense and like rising states during this attack. You have the countdown to the Death Star being reached within reach of a strike, then the TIE fighters coming in and knocking out the X-Wings, then Vader joining in until like that release of Han Solo coming in. And when I first watched it, I had forgotten about Han Solo after he left. Like I was not expecting him to come back, but they actually like seeded that very well.
The end of this movie, it's my favorite. In my opinion, it's the best ending of any Star Wars movie because it does everything right. Like the whole trench run, like the build up to it, like they have the little meeting where they're talking about how they're going to do it, and people are like, are you crazy? We just got little starfighters, and then they're flying in, and they're getting in some shootouts and stuff, and all the while you've got the ticking clock of the Death Star's getting closer. And then once they start getting into the trench, they have another countdown because they've got, how many meters till they can make the shot. So you've got countdowns within countdowns, and then you got Vader picking people off. And then, to your point, you totally forget about Han Solo because it's been like a half an hour or something since you've seen him. I remember hearing that, specifically Marcia Lucas, who edited the film, which is George Lucas's wife at the time. She said that when Han Solo shows up at the end, if people don't cheer, the movie doesn't work. And she's right. But at the same time, I remember hearing stories about people standing up in the theater and cheering when it happens because it's such a rising, heroic moment. And like you totally forget about Han Solo because you're so invested in what's going on, and he just kind of just faded out of the story. So when he comes back, it's unexpected, it's heroic, and like the whole thing, the totality of the whole like trench run Death Star attack, I think is perfect. So it's to this day, it's still my favorite like Star Wars ending.
I think it's the best. I think Rogue One does come close, although those stakes are set because of A New Hope.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard to couch that without the knowledge of history. But yeah, and Rogue One does flip it to where I'd say the main characters, spoiler alert, die before the like big ending action spectacle with Vader. But it is cool, like going back to Vader, like he is also a setup here. He's not the big bad. He actually seems somewhat reasonable.
Yeah.
One of his Imperial officers talks back to him, which, I don't think would ever happen in any new media with Darth Vader.
Yep.
Like everybody seems afraid suddenly after A New Hope of him. But yeah, I just like the seeds planted of future antagonists throughout the Star Wars films.
To your point about Vader, there's this little scene in the moment. It's in the scene where I think where Alderaan's blown up, and Tarkin is confronting Leia, and she's so afraid of him that she backs up into Vader. It always like in retrospect we know that's her dad, so it feels almost like fatherly in a way. Clearly it's not, but at the same time it always kind of was just funny to me that Darth Vader is standing behind her and she backs up into him because she's terrified of Tarkin.
Darth Vader respects Leia, like she was resistant to torture, essentially. Yep. And he also prevents Tarkin from executing her to use her as bait.
I would like to get your opinion about, so we talked a lot about Darth Vader. Let's talk about the other side of the Force. I would like to get your opinion on Ben Kenobi because in this movie he's kind of he's the remnant of the glorious, previous age, and he's basically there to be the mentor to put Luke on the path and then exit stage left, which he does. And honestly, part of the reason I love the trench run so much is the scenes where Ben is talking to him and the Force theme kicks in and like the camera is just kind of like bobbing up and down in the trench. It always feels kind of almost religious. I don't know. It just kind of moves me. But specifically about Ben, he has and part of this is because it's been retconned with subsequent movies. But when you look at the things he tells Luke, and then you look at the truth of the matter, I guess how do you view his motives, and how do you feel about him as a character? Because I think when you watch this movie, having seen like all the other Star Wars, you start to really wonder like what's his play? Like why is he being like shady with the truth and that kind of stuff?
So you're referring specifically to him saying that Darth Vader killed Anakin Skywalker, or
well yeah, that part, or just I mean that's the main thing is really Luke's origin story and how he knew his dad and all that stuff.
So, I mean, removing from the fact that George Lucas wasn't sure Darth Vader and Anakin were going to be the same person at the time.
Yep.
I do think it works because I actually separate Ben Kenobi from Obi-Wan Kenobi. Like, they are two different characters, literally,
Mm-hmm.
figuratively to me. So I can separate Darth Vader and Anakin Skywalker. I have no problem with it. And I could chalk it up to, like, this old man doesn't want to have to go into that now. Like, I'll wait till I'm dead and, like, he can't, and I can disappear at a will, you know.
Yeah, I mean,
I gotta get this kid to the rebellion. I don't want any questions, but I think, you know, Sir Alec Guinness is great in this role. I think he serves his purpose. He sells his exposition, serves as a mentor figure. But I think the character is better served in other films. And I actually think he's more memorable as a Force ghost in Empire and Return of the Jedi.
oh, interesting. Okay.
But it's weird. Like, I think of, you know, I don't think of Ben Kenobi that much because I think of Ben Kenobi as Sir Alec Guinness, and Obi-Wan Kenobi, I think of Ewan McGregor, which is the one I've seen the most of.
To your point, like I love Ewan McGregor's portrayal of Obi-Wan, and I agree. Like I prefer his portrayal, which is weird because his performance is based on Alec Guinness's, so he's almost doing like a play on Alec Guinness playing a role when he does Obi-Wan. But I actually like that a lot, and so I agree. I guess I hadn't really realized I was doing it too, but I was kind of compartmentalizing the characters too, where it was Ben and Obi-Wan, and they really were different characters. I did have a thought when I was watching it this last time that I wanted to run by you. The 9 sequence Star Wars or Skywalker saga are all about the Skywalkers. There's a clear path here where Star Wars doesn't go that way because, to your point, when A New Hope was made, Darth Vader was not Anakin Skywalker. Those were separate characters, and if George had kept that path, Star Wars looks totally different. And I think part of the thing that I've struggled with any new Star Wars is a lot of times it feels like it's kind of just always circling back to the Skywalkers, and like I love Skywalkers, but I'm kind of tired of them at the same time. Like, this is supposed to be like a huge galaxy with lots of people. Like, why do we still have this family soap opera about these handful of people? Like, show me anything else is how I feel about it, which is why I get excited about like The Mandalorian or The Acolyte or something, because it's something divorced totally from everything we know or have seen before. So I think it's, on one hand, if Anakin is not Darth Vader, obviously you don't have the all-time mic drop of I'm your father in Empire, and Empire looks totally different if that's not the case. But at the same time, I feel like the choice to make Anakin Darth Vader kind of forced the saga like inward in a way where coming out of this movie, it felt like Star Wars is expansive and it could go in any direction. But then just that one change made it this familial story that is like ever after feels like it's always turning backwards onto the Skywalkers.
I think that's why it's so popular, because it's a space opera, which means it's a soap opera. Soap operas revolve around families with difficult relationships, and I think it's like why I, I don't like, high fantasy, but I'll watch House of Dragon because it's a family drama. It's there's something really appealing about that. I think it was the right decision. I think it was the right decision to have Leia be his twin sister.
Do you like that one? Okay.
I do. Yeah.
So are you disappointed then that we didn't get Leia Jedi? That was like, it seemed like that was on the table, right?
I am, but again, like, Star Wars is a expanding text. There's opportunities if they want to cast a new Leia to get that.
That's true.
We get a little bit of it in Rise of Skywalker. I've only seen that movie once.
Same. So, okay, I have to ask you, is it because you hate it or just because you haven't got around to it?
I swear I'm a Star Wars fan, but honestly, I have no problem with seeing a Star Wars film or TV series, and I'm like, it wasn't for me. I don't need to see it again. I mean, some of these films I have to see again because writing. There are very few Star Wars films that I'll at any given moment want to rewatch in their entirety. I will go through some films and like just watch scenes, but I haven't had a desire to revisit Rise of Skywalker.
Yeah.
What about you?
It's my least favorite Star Wars. Like you said, I saw it the one time. I saw it on opening night, and yeah, it's my least favorite Star Wars. And really, the bigger issue I have with it is I love The Force Awakens and Last Jedi, and The Rise of Skywalker just kind of like it like soured the rest of those movies, like because the conclusion is so unsatisfying. It's all like I haven't been able to revisit either of the other two movies. It's kind of like how the finale, the last season of Game of Thrones, like kind of almost ruined everything that came before it because where it ends is such a disappointment, I guess. I am gonna rewatch it at some point because I kind of just want to see it again, but I just yeah. Like I love Star Wars. Like even the Star Wars movies, like Attack of the Clones, I don't think is a good movie. But like to your point, I'll rewatch scenes of that movie that I love because they're awesome. There's awesome scenes and moments that happen that I love, and I don't remember feeling that way about the Rise of Skywalker at all. I don't I don't want to say it has no redeeming qualities, but like I can't think of any right now.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of the Skywalker saga, I like the fact that Rey was being set up as being a nobody.
Thank you.
Like,
yes.
Which I think is a great message to send to the kids who Star Wars is for. She could have still like adopted the Skywalker moniker and it would be the Skywalker saga, but making her a Palpatine, like in the end, Palpatine won. He lived on while the Skywalkers died, right? So really, like Palpatine wins.
Yes, that's the story. Palpatine returns no matter what you do. Sometimes he comes back.
It was just a weird decision.
It was, and I think it was one that like they felt they had to make because they felt like she had to tie into the existing narrative somehow. And to your point, I think the right choice was to say no, she doesn't, but she can be adopted into it. I think that's a lot more powerful story. And then it kind of allows you to just open up the future. Like you can tell any stories at that point. Like it doesn't have to be about Skywalkers anymore. It could have been a very symbolic like ending and like a rebirth of the franchise that unfortunately we did not get.
Yeah, that's what makes Star Wars A New Hope so special, because you watch it and you know there was no pressure to live up to existing material. It's just make a great story.
Yep.
And we'll see what happens.
Yes. Yep. There's something so pure about that. I hope this isn't going to put you on the spot. I do want to know, because I'm curious, like what's your top 5 Star Wars look like? It doesn't have to be ranked, but I'm just like, what are your 5 favorite Star Wars movies?
A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back. I'm going to say Solo.
Oh, okay.
Return of the Jedi. And Rogue One.
That's a good list. The Solo placement did surprise me, but I get it. Like I really liked Solo.
I'm going on rewatchability. Like,
so these are the ones that you'll. Okay.
Yeah, those are they're one and the same to me. Like, love to rewatch it. Like, those are my favorite. What about you?
So I'm actually in the middle of writing an article about this, but I haven't actually gotten to the bottom of it to rank my top 5. No, I'm gonna tell you.
No worries.
I'm just saying I have to think about it. I mean, A New Hope and Empire are on the list 100%. Rogue One is on the list. This is where it gets tricky because The Force Awakens, like I want to put it on the list because it's such a fun movie. It evokes the best parts of A New Hope for me, in that it's propulsive. There's a lot of emotion. Like I love the cast, and it like after the prequels, I was a little afraid for Star Wars, and then The Force Awakens came out, and it reminded me like why I love Star Wars in the first place, because it just crackled with emotion and energy, and it was just a fun movie. So it's Force Awakens probably I'm talking myself into it. It's probably on the list, and then number 5, probably The Last Jedi. Yeah.
Can I say, Star Wars: The Force Awakens has one of the best first acts in any Star Wars film.
It's incredible.
I think the way they introduced those main cast members, especially Daisy Ridley and her performance, is incredible.
Yeah, I would have watched an entire movie of her just like bumming around Jakku, like making her like instant dinners and like scavenging, and her watching wistfully as ships are leaving the planet, and like it's such powerful storytelling. And yeah, that's part of the reason I love that movie is I love Finn and I love Rey, and yeah, and that's why I struggle with The Rise of Skywalker, because I'm not like super happy with like where their stories ended. But what are some of your favorite like scenes, little moments, or just things from this movie that, like, to your point about it's like sometimes you'll just throw something on, like what are the things that if you got 5 minutes and you want to watch a scene or some moments from this movie, like what are the ones you would dial up?
Probably the rescue of Princess Leia, and just watching Harrison Ford, Mark Hamill, and Carrie Fisher just like find their way out of the Death Star, I think is great. I love R2-D2, introducing a character that doesn't speak English, but you convey how much personality he has, and the back and forth between C-3PO I think is great. And I like the end where C-3PO at this whole film, he's gone like, I don't care about you, and C-3PO is like a mess when they bring R2-D2 down from Luke's X-Wing, and he's like beat up, and he's like, C-3PO is like, will he be fine? And Luke's like, he's fine, he'll be fine.
Yeah, right. I'm going to get my medal.
Yeah, just walks off. But they do make a point to show R2-D2 like happy, new and shiny at the end. So
looking better than ever. Any others?
Just that it's a complete story. Like I want to say it's like perfect for the time. I know there's issues with it, like looking in retrospect, but it's just a great, fun first entry for anyone into Star Wars.
It is. Yep, I totally agree. Yeah, in fact, when my kids were old enough to start seeing these movies, at that point I could have started them with the prequels, but I started them with A New Hope, and then we went to Empire and Jedi, and then we went back to the prequels, because I feel like when Star Wars has been around 50 years, there's lots of different on-ramps to Star Wars, but in my opinion, this is still the best introduction to it. It's funny, it is a little old. You can kind of tell it was made in the 70s, but at the same time, it remains timeless in a way that I think it plays well no matter like when you're coming into it.
How do your kids feel about the prequels?
So my daughter isn't really a Star Wars fan, despite my best efforts. And she was with us, and maybe it's because she hated The Rise of Skywalker. I don't know, because she went with she was big time into the Rey storyline. Like she loved Rey. But yeah, so we went to see The Rise of Skywalker opening night, and then from that point on, she was kind of like, I don't like Star Wars anymore. My son, he was always a Star Wars kid, and he liked the prequels a lot, because he was like the right age, like a young boy, and those movies are a lot of exciting things happening, and you can kind of, as a kid, you kind of can like put blinders on and just overlook like the bad dialogue or like the clunky like love scenes and stuff, and just because you can just like razor focus on like the exciting stuff. And then like when the Clone Wars cartoon came out, like he got into that, so, and he had all the toys and stuff, which is kind of like kit and caboodle with Star Wars. Like you like the movies and you buy the merchandise, and so he got big time into it. But it's weird. I wouldn't say he's like as big as a Star Wars fan as I am. He's more like, he got big into the MCU, and that was like his number one thing. he just kind of, I feel like he bounces around a lot more with his interests, whereas I just kind of keep coming back to the Star Wars stuff.
Yeah. We haven't talked about animation that much, but animation does have some of the best Star Wars storytelling.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah. Did you, how do you feel about Rebels?
Rebels, actually, I like Rebels. I don't hold it in high regard as everyone does.
Mm-hmm.
My favorite is actually The Bad Batch.
Okay.
I really love The Bad Batch. I love Omega. I love like that there were some major stakes in that. There were stakes in Rebels too, which I think animation has a better handle on handling stakes than the live action has. So, and I love Clone Wars, of course, and I love Star Wars Resistance.
Yeah, I haven't seen Resistance yet. I still would like to go back to it. The reason I brought up Rebels is because it, to me, it intentionally kind of evoked this era, like the original trilogy, in like the look and the sounds and stuff. So I was curious if that like resonated with you more. Because it definitely like pushed all my buttons, because it was like, oh, this is Star Wars, like they're stormtroopers and like everything sounds like Star Wars and that kind of thing. The Clone Wars, I struggled a bit with the anthology nature of it, because I kind of wanted a story that like was cohesive, and it jumps around a lot, and so it really wasn't until like the last season or so where it really focused down on getting to like Order 66 and like Ahsoka's story that like it really came alive for me. But up to that point, I was just like okay with it. And then Bad Batch, I've only seen like the first season of.
Oh, I would finish Bad Batch.
All right, I'll prioritize that.
Yeah, I owe a rewatch of Rebels. I also think I don't like Ahsoka, the series. I didn't like it. So
the live action
I feel
series?
I feel like that's kind of maybe tainted my opinion a little. But
yeah, it was frustrating, because I feel like it could have been really good, but it was like trying to be, it was almost like you had to like love Rebels to like Ahsoka, because it was almost like the next season of Rebels. And there were some really cool stuff with Ahsoka, but at the same time, like the storytelling, the direction it went, like some of the story choices, like the whole Sabine like Force stuff, like that was the stuff I struggled with. It just wasn't satisfying.
Nope. But it's getting a second season, so
we'll see. Yep, we'll see, hopefully. But I did like seeing Ezra back, and I think the actor they cast for him did really well, and so that was cool. I like that part of it.
Yeah. And I like Hera. I think Hera is probably my favorite out of Rebels.
Yeah, for sure.
I think Mary Elizabeth Winstead, I think she did a good job.
She did good. I agree. And I like who plays Ahsoka? Her name's escaping me right now.
Rosario Dawson.
Thank you. Rosario Dawson. I love her as an actress, and I think she plays the character great. Like she's exactly as I picture Ahsoka would be. But like with the series, like she was just like emotionally like dead, and like I wanted some emotion from her or something, and it just felt like she was kind of like two steps back, and then so I had a hard time, even though like I love the character and I love the actress, like I had a hard time like just like getting emotionally like caught up in the story, because it like didn't want me to, almost, you know.
It reminded me of the prequels a little bit, as far as the stiffness.
Yes, exactly like that. And maybe that was intentional, but it was kind of off-putting.
Can't escape those prequels.
Yeah, no matter what we do, we cannot escape them. Krista, this seems like a great place to wrap it up. This is an awesome conversation. I'd like to just throw it back to you. Like, is there anything you'd like to plug, where people find you, that kind of thing?
Yeah, you could find me on Medium at Credits in Canon, and my site, creditsincanon.com. I'm in all those channels.
If you're into Star Wars, definitely check out creditsincanon.com. And it's canon, like COCANON, as in like story canon, not like a cannon gun.
Yeah, credits is in the monetary value in Star Wars, and canon as in the lore.
Yes. So it's very Star Wars centric. I would recommend it if you're listening to this pod because you like Star Wars. You'll love the website. And then her work on Medium. We've only talked about Star Wars here, but she's published a lot of pop culture type stuff on Medium, and her writing is superb. So I definitely recommend you check it out. Krista, thanks for coming on. This was a ton of fun.
Thank you for having me, Eric.